The morning sun hit the cul-de-sac like a flash of gold on glass, gleaming off every manicured lawn and power-washed driveway. Sunridge Meadows was a neighborhood that looked perfect from the outside rows of pastel homes trimmed with neat fences, flags fluttering proudly, and flower beds that bloomed in regulation-approved shades of red and yellow. But beneath that perfection, there was a wrought and invisible pressure that made people lower their voices, measure their grass, and check their mailboxes twice a day for warning letters from the board. And that board, the HOA, wasn't just an organization. It was a system of control. The kind that smiled for community photos while quietly breaking people's backs with fines, warnings, and threats. It was here that Mara Dalton, a single mother and paraplegic, lived with her teenage son, Ethan. She'd bought her home after years of saving, dreaming of peace and stability. What she didn't realize then was that peace came with paperwork, rules, and a board that thought of compassion as a weakness. Her front door faced the street directly, a few small concrete steps separating it from the sidewalk. For most homeowners, it was a design feature. For Mara, it was an obstacle. When she moved in, her son and a few friends built a small wooden ramp, sturdy, simple, unpainted, to make it easier for her to get in and out of her own home. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't permanent. But it was freedom. That ramp became her way to reach the world. Until one morning, she found the first letter. It came in an envelope stamped with the HOA logo and oak tree in gold foil, as if they were issuing royal decrees. The letter stated her ramp was a non-conforming exterior modification and demanded removal within 10 days or a fine of $250 per day. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Surely they didn't mean a mobility ramp. Surely no one would fine a disabled homeowner for accessibility. But the next morning, another letter came. This time with photos. The ramp, circled in red ink. Words like unsightly, non-approved, and disruptive to neighborhood harmony. The word echoed through her mind like a curse. The ramp wasn't painted. That was the offense. Not its existence, but its color. Or rather, its lack of conformity to architectural harmony. A few neighbors even complained that it lowered property values. No one came to ask her. No one knocked on her door. The board simply declared her ramp a violation and unleashed the machine. By a week's end, the fines reached over $1,000. Each letter grew sharper, colder, more official. And behind those letters stood one name, Carol Fincher, HOA president. Carol had ruled Sunridge Meadows for 8 years. She called herself a steward of community standards, but most called her Queen Carol behind closed doors. Her word was law, and her smile was sharper than the edge of a freshly printed violation notice. The HOA's motto printed on every newsletter read, "Preserve the beauty, protect the value, enforce the standards." But those standards had become weapons. Mara tried reasoning, emailing, explaining, but logic didn't work here. Compassion didn't fit into bylaws. The fines continued. The board refused to approve a painted version of the ramp, claiming wooden structures were not in the neighborhood's design palette. Mara's savings were gone after the home purchase. She couldn't afford that, and the board knew it. As the letters piled up, her stress deepened. She spent nights staring at the ramp through the window, wondering if her independence was really something she'd have to pay for. Her son grew angrier, talking about cameras and lawsuits, but she stayed quiet. The HOA had lawyers. She didn't, until one morning she found something new taped to her door, a lien notice. The HOA had the power to place a lien on her property for unpaid fines. If the balance wasn't settled, they could initiate foreclosure. All because of a ramp. That morning, something broke in her, not her hope, but her tolerance. She called the county. She called 80 advocates. She called local reporters, though none returned her messages. Then she did something she'd never done before. She filmed a video. It wasn't polished, just her sitting in her wheelchair, reading the HOA's letter aloud. Her voice trembled not from fear, but from disbelief. She explained the situation, the fines, the refusal to approve accessibility, and the threats to take her home. She posted it online. By evening, it had been shared hundreds of times. By morning, thousands. People were outraged. Disabled rights groups, veterans, single parents, even other homeowners sick of HOA abuse. They called it discrimination. They called it tyranny. And in that storm of attention, something changed. The board met the next day not to apologize, but to dig in deeper. They claimed her video misrepresented the association. They issued another violation for public defamation of the HOA. They fined her again. But this time, she didn't delete the post. This time, she doubled down. She began reading the HOA's bylaws publicly, line by line, highlighting every clause that violated federal accessibility standards. She learned that federal law, the AD, overrode HOA restrictions when it came to mobility accommodations. In their arrogance, the board had broken the law. What began as punishment became publicity. Local news stations picked up the story. Neighbors started whispering. Some were furious, others ashamed. But the HOA didn't care. Their pride was too old, too rigid. Until something even they couldn't ignore arrived, a letter from the Department of Justice. The rant that started as a violation had become evidence. That night, Mara sat on her porch, the ramp glowing under the streetlight like a symbol of quiet defiance. Her fines were frozen pending investigation, but she knew this wasn't over. Carol wouldn't back down. And neither would she. That's when she noticed an envelope slipped under her door, anonymous, plain. Inside, a single note. If you want to beat them, don't fight from the outside. Run for the board. For the first time since the nightmare began, she smiled. The war had just begun, and this time, she wouldn't be the one defending. The note sat on her kitchen table all night, illuminated by the pale glow of her phone. No signature, no explanation. Just 7 words that pulsed in her mind like a heartbeat. If you want to beat them, run for the board. It was ridiculous, at least, at first glance. Mara Dalton, the woman they fined into near bankruptcy, joining the same group that had targeted her. It felt like walking into a snake pit. Yet the more she thought about it, the more the idea spread through her like fire. The HOA wasn't a building. It wasn't even a collection of rules. It was people. Ordinary neighbors who'd been convinced they were part of something noble, while following the commands of one woman who'd forgotten what community even meant. And people could be replaced. The bylaws, printed neatly in the HOA handbook, spelled it out clearly. Board members served 2-year terms. Elections occurred every March, but the recall clause buried in the fine print allowed homeowners to remove a sitting member if 25% of residents signed a petition. It had never happened in Sunridge Meadows. Carol Fincher's control was too absolute. She'd ruled with a smile and a spreadsheet, using favors, warnings, and fear to keep everyone aligned. She hosted holiday parties, sent cookies to new residents, and made sure her allies filled every committee seat. But now, something was shifting. Since the DOJ letter arrived, whispers had begun to ripple through the community. A few residents started asking questions in private Facebook groups. Others quietly mentioned their own fines, the ones for flower pots, mailbox colors, patio furniture. The one silent majority was stirring, like a town realizing it had been living under quiet tyranny. And in that restless silence, Mara began her campaign not with posters or slogans, but with listening. She wheeled down sidewalks, past pastel homes and trimmed hedges, introducing herself not as an activist, but as a neighbor. She asked questions. How many times had you been fined? What did they say when you appealed? She listened to stories of petty cruelty, a retired veteran fined for his flagpole being an inch too tall, a young couple charged for having a playset visible from the street, an elderly woman threatened for feeding stray cats. Every story was a crack in the facade of perfection. Every voice added to a growing undercurrent of anger, but Carol's regime had eyes everywhere. Her vice president, Frank Mallory, lived 3 houses down from Mara. His security cameras faced the street, recording everyone who passed. He attended every committee meeting, always with a tablet in hand and that self-satisfied smirk of someone who thought enforcement was a sacred duty. When Mara's car was spotted parked at a neighbor's house, she'd receive a notice the next day. Unauthorized assembly or solicitation. Still, she persisted. She learned how to navigate their world, how to speak in HOA language. She quoted their own bylaws back to them, word for word, until they couldn't accuse her of breaking anything. She filed records requests, demanded transparency in spending, and posted everything online. She wasn't defying the rules anymore, she was using them. By December, she'd quietly built a network, a handful of neighbors who shared her videos, printed flyers, and attended meetings to observe. They called themselves the Recall Whisperers. In every HOA, there were two kinds of people, those who obeyed and those who complied. Mara was teaching the second group to think like the first. The recall effort began with whispers, literally. Notes slipped under doors, anonymous text messages. A few brave souls leaving unsigned flyers near mailboxes. The message was simple. If the HOA doesn't represent us, we can replace it. The first major breakthrough came when Tom and Linda Parker, owners of one of the oldest homes in the community, stepped forward. They'd been fined 5 years ago for adding solar panels. Carol had called them unsightly technology. The Parkers had fought it and lost, but never forgot. When they signed the recall petition, others followed. Mara spent nights filling spreadsheets, names, lot numbers, signatures, and complaint histories. Her kitchen became a war room of manila folders and printed bylaws. Every piece of paper represented a vote, a voice, a possibility. By January, she had 87 signatures. She needed 92 to meet the threshold. The HOA board tried to silence her. They accused her of unauthorized political activity. They suspended her voting rights, claiming unpaid fines. But the DOJ investigation had frozen those fines, which meant she was still a full homeowner in good standing. When she pointed that out in the next public meeting, the crowd erupted in applause. For the first time, Carol's mask cracked. The next day, HOA maintenance trucks drove past her home and stopped in front. Workers took pictures of her ramp again. They left notices. They claimed she was obstructing public easements. Mara filmed everything. Every threat, every letter, every act of pettiness. She uploaded it all online. The videos weren't just evidence, they were exposure. Millions watched as she narrated her journey like a real-time documentary of small-town power gone wrong. And with every upload, more neighbors reached out. People from across the country sent messages, former HOA victims, lawyers, even journalists. Her story became a symbol of resistance, the perfect mix of personal courage and bureaucratic injustice. By February, she had 143 signatures, enough to trigger a recall. The HOA was legally required to hold a special election within 30 days. The announcement went out in a printed notice, reluctantly posted by Carol herself. Pursuant to Article 4, Section 12, a recall vote will be held on March 15th to determine the removal of the current board of directors. It was the first recall in Sunridge Meadows history. From that moment, the community divided like a fault line. Yard signs appeared overnight, some reading, "Protect the board," others, "Take back our neighborhood." Neighbors who'd once shared block parties now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. The HOA listserv became a battlefield of accusations and rumors. Carol called an emergency board meeting close to residents. But minutes leaked someone inside was feeding information to Mara. She learned about the smear campaign, that she was unstable, a lawsuit risk, funded by outsiders. She countered with transparency. Every expense she made, every document she filed, every donation she received, she posted publicly. "They hide everything," she said in one video. "So I'll hide nothing." The momentum was unstoppable. When the recall meeting finally came, the clubhouse overflowed. Over 200 residents packed the room, cameras rolling, faces tense. For the first time, Carol couldn't control the narrative. Every question was met with murmurs, every deflection with boos. And when the votes were counted by a neutral third party, the result was decisive. 4 board members removed. 1 remained the treasurer, who abstained from voting against Mara in the past. Under HOA law, a new election had to be held immediately to fill vacancies. The nominations were open. Mara's name appeared first. No speech, no slogans. Just one sentence written on the nomination form. To make the rules fair again. When the ballots were tallied that evening, she won in a landslide. The HOA that fined her for a wheelchair ramp had just elected her president. The news spread like wildfire. The same reporters who ignored her months ago now wanted interviews. Her story trended under hashtags like #HOA Revolt and #Ramp Rights. But while the internet celebrated, Mara understood something others didn't. Winning an election wasn't the end of the war, it was just the beginning of governing. Because buried in the HOA archives were layers of corruption, contracts, kickbacks, maintenance fees that never reached the community. Carol hadn't just abused power. She'd monetized it. The files she inherited as president told a story uglier than any fine. The vendor who sold those overpriced aluminum ramps? A company owned by Carol's brother-in-law. The landscaping firm that built the HOA triple the standard rate? Managed by her son-in-law. Mara realized that what began as a ramp violation was actually a doorway into something far deeper, a pattern of greed, control, and fear disguised as community management. That night, she sat alone in the HOA office, the air thick with old paper and newer lies. She opened the first file folder marked Vendor Contracts Confidential. Her phone buzzed with notifications, messages of congratulations, support, hope, but she ignored them. Her focus was locked on a single line item. Community Improvement Grant, $48,500. Landscaping enhancements, authorized by C. Fincher. The attached receipts showed something strange. 0 actual work performed, no records of labor. No invoices from subcontractors. Just money transferred from the HOA account into a private LLC. Carol hadn't just fined her unlawfully. She'd been stealing from everyone. As the realization sank in, so did the danger. She wasn't dealing with petty rules anymore, she was dismantling a system that had hidden its corruption behind the illusion of neighborly order. She locked the office, took the files, and went home. For the first time in months, she looked at her ramp, the same ramp that started it all. Its wood was weathered now, but it stood strong. It wasn't just a path to her front door anymore, it was a monument to defiance. She knew the next step wasn't punishment. It was exposure. The fine she'd endured had been public humiliation. Now, she would return the favor lawfully, transparently, and on camera. The next morning, she posted a new video titled Inside the HOA Files. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and filled with quiet vengeance. She explained what she found, flashing copies of documents and check records. She didn't accuse, she showed. The video ended with one line. This is what your HOA fees really paid for. By nightfall, the video had 1 million views. Local news called it the Sunridge Expose, but not everyone was happy. That same night, her security camera caught headlights lingering outside her house. The next morning, she found her mailbox smashed and a note inside, "Stop digging. Some of us have more to lose than you." She stared at it for a long time. Then she folded it neatly, placed it in a folder labeled Evidence, and hit record. The war wasn't over. It was evolving. The air in Sunridge Meadows changed after that video. Neighbors who once smiled politely now slowed their cars when passing Mara's house. The HOA office, once a place of petty paperwork, had become the epicenter of a community scandal. The phrase, "inside the HOA files," had spread far beyond the neighborhood gates. Mara had cracked something open, not just a system, but a silence. The HOA was no longer a quiet bureaucracy. It was a stage. Every audit, every meeting, Every document became part of a performance the world was now watching. Reporters camped near the subdivision's entrance, waiting for soundbites from residents too shocked or too frightened to speak. Inside her home, Mara built a new kind of war room. Laptops, printers, and files covered the dining table. She spent her days cataloging invoices, payment records, and communications. The paper trail told a story of greed written in spreadsheets and signatures. The HOA's books, supposedly balanced, were full of inconsistencies. The numbers didn't lie, but they didn't add up either. Tens of thousands of dollars listed under beautification projects had no corresponding receipts. Landscaping payments went to companies that didn't exist. Maintenance logs were falsified, trees supposedly trimmed that had never been touched, walls supposedly painted that still flaked with age. Every document was a breadcrumb leading deeper into corruption. She realized Carol's leadership had been more than arrogance, it had been profit. Each fine issued to homeowners, each late fee, each mandatory improvement, had been feeding a closed loop of insider vendors and fabricated expenses. And the homeowners had paid for it all. Still, Mara didn't rush. She knew exposure required precision. Every accusation had to be irrefutable. Every statement had to stand up in daylight. She wasn't going to be dismissed as emotional or vindictive. She would fight with facts, the same tools her oppressors once used against her. She requested an independent audit. Under HOA law, any homeowner could demand one with a majority vote. Now that she was president, she only needed board approval. The new board, a mix of reformers and hesitant allies, hesitated at first. Some feared the fallout. Others didn't want to believe what she'd uncovered. But the evidence spoke louder than denial. By the end of that week, the board unanimously approved an audit of all HOA finances for the past 5 years. It was the first such audit in Sunridge history. The accounting firm arrived with briefcases, laptops, and a quiet curiosity about how deep this would go. They didn't have to wait long to find out. Within days, discrepancies began surfacing. Vendor payments that exceeded budgets by 300%. Missing signatures on large transactions. Expenses listed for community equipment that didn't exist. Even the HOA's reserve fund, meant for emergencies, had been quietly drained. Mara watched as the auditors' faces changed from detached professionalism to disbelief. What they were uncovering wasn't negligence, it was manipulation. Carol Fincher had run the HOA like a private empire. She'd funneled money to family businesses, rewarded loyalists with maintenance contracts, and silenced dissent with fines. The board meetings she chaired had been scripted performances, minutes pre-written, votes predetermined. Mara had lived under the shadow of that regime, thinking she was powerless. Now she was dismantling it piece by piece. But the deeper the audit went, the louder the backlash became. Anonymous letters appeared in mailboxes claiming Mara was fabricating the investigation. A few residents who supported her began receiving sudden notices: trash can visibility violations, unapproved light fixtures. The old enforcement machine had found a way to keep working, even without its queen. Then came the vandalism. The smashed mailbox had been a warning. Now, someone slashed the tires of her car. Another night, her security camera caught a figure pouring something on her lawn, bleach that killed the grass in the shape of an X. It was psychological warfare, designed to remind her that power, even when challenged, still had claws. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she documented everything. Police reports, video footage, threat notes. She filed them neatly, labeling each folder retaliation evidence. The woman they thought they could scare into silence was instead building a case that grew more solid with every act of intimidation. The audit continued for 6 weeks. When the final report came in, it was explosive. Over $280,000 in misused HOA funds. Multiple vendors traced back to relatives of Carol and her vice president, Frank. Even a special project grant, used to renovate Carol's own backyard patio, disguised as a community accessibility initiative. The findings were irrefutable. The board's lawyer advised immediate legal action. The evidence would go to the district attorney's office. Fraud, embezzlement, abuse of authority, all neatly catalogued, all ready for prosecution. For Mara, it was vindication, but also exhaustion. The same ramp they once called unsightly had now exposed a web of corruption stretching years, but she wasn't celebrating yet. Justice had to be seen, not just said. So she prepared the most dramatic move yet. She announced an open town meeting, live-streamed, recorded, and archived, where she would publicly present the audit results to every homeowner. No secrecy, no closed doors. The announcement flyer read, "The truth about your HOA dues, Community Transparency Night, April 22nd. When the day arrived, the clubhouse overflowed again. Cameras flashed, reporters filled the back wall. The air smelled of coffee, sweat, and anxiety. Mara took the podium. Her voice was calm, steady, trained now by months of speaking on camera. She presented the findings one line at a time, charts, screenshots, transaction histories. She didn't dramatize, she didn't need to. The numbers were damning enough. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she revealed the connections, the fake companies, the missing funds, the lies hidden in the spreadsheets. By the end, the once unshakable faith in the old board had shattered. Carol Fincher wasn't there that night. She'd resigned 2 days before the meeting, citing personal reasons. But her shadow hung heavy over the room. Everyone knew she'd seen the writing on the wall, or maybe the headlines already forming. The next morning, the story hit every local outlet. HOA scandal. President uncovers $280,000 fraud ring. The comments sections exploded. Some praised Mara as a hero. Others dismissed her as attention-seeking. But the truth didn't need everyone to believe it. It only needed to exist. The district attorney opened an investigation. Subpoenas were issued. Carol vanished from public view. Her vice president, Frank, lawyered up. The remaining loyalists tried to distance themselves, but the audit had tied every one of them to transactions they couldn't explain. Sunridge Meadows was changing. For the first time, the HOA began operating like it was supposed to. Transparent budgets, public votes, resident-driven projects. The fear that once defined the community started to lift. People greeted each other again. Driveways filled with laughter instead of whispers. But for Mara, peace was complicated. She had won battles, yes. But victory brought attention, the kind that doesn't always feel safe. News vans parked outside her home. Strangers sent letters asking for advice, for interviews, for help fighting their own HOAs. She'd become a symbol, and symbols carry weight. Late at night, she sometimes replayed her old videos. The shaky footage of her first plea, the anger in her voice, the desperation in her eyes. It felt like another lifetime. Now she sat in a leather chair in the HOA office, signing documents as President Dalton. Her nameplate gleamed softly in the lamplight. Yet she knew that power, no matter who held it, always carried the potential to corrupt. That was why she'd made herself a promise. Transparency always. Every meeting live-streamed. Every budget published. Every fine reviewed by a committee of residents instead of one person's whim. She wasn't just leading an HOA, she was rebuilding trust in a community that had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. But as she looked out the window that night, she noticed something unsettling. A car parked across the street, not moving, lights off, engine idling. Her cameras captured it. The same car had appeared 3 times in the last week. She stared at the monitor, unease creeping in. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe power wasn't ready to let go just yet. Because some secrets didn't die quietly. The next morning, she received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photo, her son Ethan leaving for school. The back of the photo read, "You should have stopped after the recall." The paper trembled in her hands, not from fear, but from realization. She wasn't fighting an HOA anymore. She was fighting the people who built it, profited from it, and now wanted to bury what she'd uncovered. The audit had exposed them. But exposure wasn't the end of danger. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The photograph lay on Mara's desk still. Her son's face smiled in the morning sunlight, unaware of the lens that had captured him. The note on the back was short, but its message was loud. You should have stopped after the recall. For the first time since the ramp incident began, fear returned, not for herself, but for Ethan. She had dealt with fines, legal threats, even vandalism. But this was different. This was personal. Someone was watching, someone who knew where her son went, what time he left, where he walked. That night, she sat awake long after Ethan fell asleep. The street outside was quiet, but it no longer felt safe. Every sound, a passing car, the rustle of leaves, made her glance toward the window. She reviewed her security footage. The same car appeared again, gray sedan, tinted windows, slow-moving, unmarked plates. It idled across from her driveway for 10 minutes, then vanished into the dark. She filed a police report the next morning. The officer who came was polite but detached. Could be nothing, he said. Maybe a delivery driver. He took notes, promised to patrol the area. But Mara could tell from his eyes that he didn't understand, or didn't want to. Power leaves a scent, and she had disturbed it. While the district attorney's office worked through the audit files, she continued running the HOA, meetings, emails, repairs, all mundane tasks masking the tension beneath. The HOA was cleaner now, transparent, fair. But she knew that the people she'd exposed still had friends in places she couldn't see. By early summer, the investigation widened. Subpoenas spread beyond Carol Fincher. The name Frank Mallory appeared again, the old vice president. Records showed he'd been the one approving many of the fraudulent transfers. When questioned by investigators, he denied everything. But in the neighborhood, whispers grew that Frank was furious, cornered, desperate. He still lived 3 doors down. His camera still faced the street. His glare, when they crossed paths, was colder than law could measure. Then came the email, anonymous sender. No subject line. Just one attachment, a PDF of a balance sheet labeled Sunridge Maintenance Fund. The file showed another discrepancy, a hidden account under a different name, Meadoway Consulting. It contained deposits totaling over $40,000, all from HOA checks written during the final months of Carol's presidency. It was proof of a deeper layer of fraud, one that hadn't been included in the first audit. But the strangest part wasn't the money, it was the timestamp. The transactions had continued even after Carol resigned. Someone was still using HOA funds. Someone inside the system. Mara traced the electronic signature on the transactions. The authorization came from a shared admin login. Only 2 people had access. The treasurer, a mild-mannered retiree named Eleanor Grant, and Mara herself. The implication hit her like a storm. Someone was using her digital credentials. That night, she checked the HOA's online banking records. Access logs showed multiple logins from her account during hours she wasn't online. Late at night, between 2 and 3 a.m., the IP addresses were local. Someone nearby. She changed every password, locked accounts, alerted the auditors. But the damage was done. Someone was framing her. The next morning, an envelope appeared at the HOA office door. Inside was a printed screenshot of her supposed approval of one of the fake transactions. Written in marker across the page, "The crusader becomes the thief." The message was meant to unsettle, to reclaim power through suggestion. But Mara didn't panic. She documented it, time-stamped it, archived it. Fear would not erase her evidence. Still, she knew she was now living in the shadow war of Sunridge Meadows, the kind fought not with lawyers or bylaws, but with intimidation and whispers. The old guard wasn't gone. It had just gone underground. For weeks, she noticed small shifts. Residents who once supported her became distant. Anonymous posts appeared on community forums accusing her of profiting from the audit, and using HOA funds for publicity. Someone even spread a rumor that her ramp construction had been paid for with HOA money. Lies spread faster than truth when whispered by those who'd once enforced fear. But then something happened that shattered even her calm resolve. One morning, Ethan didn't come home from school on time. His phone went straight to voicemail. The school said he'd left at the regular hour. Panic set in like ice. 2 hours later, he returned, shaken, pale, silent. He said a gray car had followed him after he left the bus stop, pacing him slowly down the block. When he turned toward a friend's house, it sped off. That night, Mara installed additional cameras, floodlights, and a GPS tracker in her car. She sent all evidence, the photo, the threats, the recent harassment, directly to the district attorney's office. The investigation into the HOA's former board widened again. The DA's investigators began to suspect not just financial misconduct, but potential witness intimidation. In the following weeks, subpoenas turned into arrests. Frank Mallory was taken into custody for obstruction of justice and financial fraud. Another former board member, Ruth Lawson, was implicated in the fake vendor scheme. The pattern of corruption now reached 5 former officers. For the community, it was shocking. For Mara, it was confirmation. She had been right all along. The HOA had never been about property values. It had been a front for control, a private fiefdom built on fear and fines. But the arrests brought something else, vindication. When the news broke, the same neighbors who once crossed the street now brought flowers, thank you notes, even offers to help. They called her Madam President with affection, not sarcasm. For a moment, the air in Sunridge Meadows felt lighter again. The lawn still gleamed, but now there was laughter in the air, children playing without the threat of noise violations, porches decorated freely without fear of fines. Mara attended her first HOA barbecue as president. The smell of grilled food, the hum of conversation, it felt normal again, human. Yet beneath that normalcy, her instincts stayed alert. She knew that corruption didn't disappear overnight. Power, once lost, tries to claw its way back in through charm, guilt, or disguise. So she kept digging. Months passed. Summer turned to autumn. The HOA's finances stabilized. A new treasurer was elected, budgets published publicly, and fines were reviewed under a fair process. Then one morning, she received a package, no sender listed, just a brown parcel wrapped in twine. Inside was a single USB drive and a typed note. Everything Carol didn't want you to find. Mara stared at it for a long moment. Then she plugged it into a disconnected laptop. The drive contained folders, hundreds of scanned documents, photos, spreadsheets, and emails. It was a digital archive of everything Carol had done behind the scenes. Contracts, messages, private correspondences with developers, even discussions about rezoning property near Sunridge Meadows for personal profit. One file stood out, HOA expansion plan, confidential. It detailed a plan Carol had been negotiating with a real estate developer to sell off a portion of community land, the shared park and pond area to build luxury townhomes. The sale would have generated millions, with a private consulting fee routed to her own account. It was dated only 6 months before the recall. The scale of corruption was staggering. The HOA hadn't just been oppressive, it had been poised to dismantle the very community it pretended to protect. Mara printed everything, logged it, and delivered the drive to the district attorney. Later that week, the DA's office held a press conference. They announced additional criminal charges: fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit theft. Carol Fincher was officially named in the indictment. Sunridge Meadows had become the cautionary tale of HOA abuse across the country. News anchors called it the case that changed community governance. Legislators began discussing bills to regulate HOA power and protect residents' rights. Advocacy groups named Mara as the voice that started the movement. Yet through it all, she never saw herself as a crusader. She was just a woman who wanted to use her front door without permission. But destiny had turned that door into a battleground. Now, sitting on her porch as the sun set over the quiet street, she looked at the ramp again. Its wood was fading, but its meaning had grown brighter. It had carried her into a fight she never asked for and given her a purpose she'd never imagined. Still, the shadows of Sunridge lingered. Carol was awaiting trial. Frank had turned state's evidence. But there were whispers that not everyone had been caught, that someone else had helped move the money, someone still inside the neighborhood. And when the evening wind carried the faint sound of tires rolling slowly past her home once more, Mara knew the story wasn't finished. The HOA had been reborn. Yes, fairer, cleaner, more transparent. But justice in places like Sunridge Meadows was never complete. It came in waves, one scandal washing away the last, one truth illuminating another. She wasn't naive anymore. She knew that peace in a place built on control was temporary, something you earned, defended, and rebuilt, over and over again. That night before heading inside, she looked at the camera mounted above her porch, the same one that had once captured threats and vandalism, and smiled faintly. Let them watch. Because this time she was watching too. And this time, she had the law, the truth, and the community on her side. The ramp that once made her a target had made her a leader. And leaders don't run from shadows. They light the path through them. The day the indictment went public, Sunridge Meadows stopped being just a neighborhood. It became a headline. Reporters lined the sidewalks like vultures circling a battlefield, their cameras pointed toward a cul-de-sac that once symbolized order and now represented exposure. The HOA sign at the entrance, once polished weekly, stood crooked, one screw missing, like the mask of perfection had finally fallen. Inside her house, Mara Dalton watched the news unfold in silence. Her name appeared in bold letters. Whistleblower HOA president exposes massive corruption. Interviews replayed clips from her videos, dissecting her tone, her past, even her smile. Some called her a hero. Others called her an opportunist. Fame, she realized, had its own kind of fine. The phone never stopped ringing. Journalists, advocacy groups, podcasts, even lawyers representing other HOA victims. Her inbox filled with hundreds of messages a day. People wanted her advice, her story, her face on their cause. And through it all, she was still running an HOA. The irony was inescapable. The same title that once represented her oppression now made her a national spokesperson. But while the media called her the woman who took down her HOA, she knew the truth was messier. She hadn't destroyed it. She'd rebuilt it. Still, not everyone saw it that way. Some neighbors began to resent the attention. Strangers drove through the community, taking photos. The peace that had returned was thinning under the weight of celebrity. It wasn't just about houses anymore. It was about power, politics, and image. Soon the cameras came closer. Documentary crews requested access. National networks wanted to feature the revolution of one neighborhood. Politicians reached out privately, eager to attach their names to her success. They called it reform. She called it theater. But she understood how the game worked now. If power had been used to silence her once, she could now use visibility to protect herself. The more the public saw, the harder it became for shadows to move unseen. So she agreed to one interview, a long-form expose filmed in her living room where she told her story in her own words. She spoke about fear, control, and the quiet violence of bureaucracy. About the ramp that became rebellion. About the neighbors who chose silence over solidarity until silence became guilt. The interview aired on a Sunday evening. Within hours, it went viral again. Mara Dalton, once a faceless homeowner in a forgotten suburb, was now the face of a national movement. But fame comes with attention, and attention draws predators. She started receiving strange packages. Unmarked boxes. Anonymous letters claiming to have inside information on other corrupt HOAs, most of them fake, some laced with threats. Then came the legal countersuit. Carol Fincher's lawyer filed a defamation claim, alleging Mara had publicly humiliated her client and falsely accused her of criminal acts. It was absurd. The indictment itself proved otherwise, but the lawsuit wasn't meant to win. It was meant to drain her. Her lawyer called it a SLAPP suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation, a tactic designed to intimidate. Mara refused to be intimidated. She live-streamed her response. Calm, professional, precise. She explained what the lawsuit was, why it existed, and how it represented the last gasp of a system collapsing under its own lies. Viewers flooded her with support. Donations poured in to cover legal fees. The court of public opinion was no longer in Carol's favor, but the stress began to wear her down. Her days blurred into endless calls and filings. Her nights filled with a low hum of anxiety. Ethan tried to stay strong, but she could see the weight on him too, the fear of walking outside, the whispers at school. She had won justice, but lost privacy. The price of exposure was isolation. Even inside her home, she felt watched. Every creak of the floorboard reminded her of that first threat. Every passing car made her heart tighten for a moment before she forced herself to breathe again. Still, she refused to step back. If they wanted to bury her story, she would make it too public to erase. She launched a new initiative, Fair Home Now, a nonprofit dedicated to helping homeowners fight HOA abuse. She partnered with disability advocates, legal experts, and financial auditors. Within months, Fair Home Now had hundreds of members nationwide. What began as one woman's fight was now a movement. But as the movement grew, so did its enemies. Developers, property management firms, even lobbyists began targeting her name. Anonymous blogs accused her of anti-HOA extremism. Paid articles tried to discredit her audits. Behind the scenes, something more coordinated was forming, a backlash led by national HOA lobby groups who saw her as a threat to their business model. Emails leaked, showing real estate firms strategizing to neutralize the Dalton effect. Neutralize. The word lingered like smoke. It was no longer about one neighborhood. It was about a billion-dollar industry built on compliance. And Mara, unwillingly, had become its symbol of rebellion. Then, one afternoon, she received a visit that confirmed her suspicions. Two men in suits, not police, not journalists, arrived at her office requesting a conversation about public image. They represented a regional HOA management corporation. Their tone was polite, but every word dripped with suggestion. They offered funding for her nonprofit. In exchange, they wanted partnership messaging, positive content about HOA oversight, balanced narratives, mutual benefit. In other words, silence disguised as compromise. She turned them down flat. When they left, one of them smiled and said, "Careful, Miss Dalton. You've already changed more than they wanted you to." That night, the HOS community website was hacked. Dozens of pages replaced with distorted text reading, "Fair Home is a fraud." The attack was traced to an IP address in another state, untraceable beyond that. It was a message, not a crime of opportunity. Still, she persisted. She rebuilt the site, doubled her security, and posted a video explaining what had happened. Her voice in that video was different, calmer, heavier, more seasoned. The fire was still there, but it had evolved into something deeper. Purpose, not anger. She spoke about the cycle of control, how systems survive through fear, and how truth, once spoken, becomes unstoppable, even when its messenger is attacked. The comments flooded with support. People shared stories of their own HOAs, their own injustices, their own small rebellions. Mara realized that she wasn't alone anymore. And yet, beneath the wave of support, something darker simmered. One night, while reviewing files, she received another email, this one from a personal account she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "You don't know the half of it." The message contained a single attachment, a document labeled Sun Ridge Agreement 2017. When she opened it, her pulse quickened. It was a scanned contract between Carol Fincher and a regional developer. The signatures were real, the notary seal valid. The document showed that years before the scandal, Carol had granted the developer exclusive access to community records, resident data, and voting rolls, all in exchange for consulting fees. The implication was horrifying. The HOA hadn't just been corrupt. It had been selling personal information about residents for years. Every address, every complaint, every financial statement. And it didn't stop there. The contract included a renewal clause, one that automatically extended every 5 years unless terminated by the current HOA president. Which meant that unless Mara acted now, that agreement, signed in secret long before her presidency, would renew next month. It wasn't over. It had never been over. She was sitting on top of a machine that had been feeding on privacy and trust for nearly a decade. Her mind raced. How deep did it go? How many other HOAs had signed similar deals? How many perfect neighborhoods across the country were really data farms disguised as communities? That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the quiet streets of Sunridge Meadows, the same lawns, the same houses, the same illusion of safety. It was all built on contracts and compliance, on silence. And she was about to break that silence again. The next morning, she called an emergency board meeting. Her board members listened in shock as she explained the document. They voted unanimously to terminate the contract immediately. But she knew termination wasn't enough. Exposure was the only safeguard, so she went public again. Her next video wasn't about corruption or revenge or reform. It was about truth, the truth behind the system itself. She called it the hidden economy of HOAs. In it, she revealed how homeowners' personal data had been monetized through third-party contracts, how surveillance disguised as security had been collecting and selling information for profit. The video shattered the internet. Within hours, news networks picked it up. Within days, congressional aides reached out. Within a week, regulators announced an investigation into HOA data privacy violations nationwide. Mara had started with one ramp. Now she had cracked open an entire industry. But as the headlines grew, she felt something heavier settle in her chest. Exhaustion, maybe, or a quiet realization. She couldn't do this forever. Movements don't survive on one person's endurance. They survive on legacy. And as she watched her son walk down the ramp that had once changed everything, she finally allowed herself to think about rest, not surrender, just rest. Because even revolutions need silence to gather strength again. The ramp stood beneath the porch light, warm but sturdy, its grain reflecting the glow like an old scar that healed. It wasn't just wood. It was memory, defiance, truth, and the beginning of something far bigger than the street it rested on. Mara smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes not from victory, but from understanding. Every war leaves shadows. But every shadow proves that light has already been there. The morning after her video, The Hidden Economy of HOAs, went viral. Mara Dalton woke to silence, not peace, but the kind that comes before a storm. Her phone, once flooded with messages of gratitude and solidarity, was now choked with warnings, hate mail, and legal threats. It had taken less than 24 hours for her crusade to reach the people who truly controlled the game. National headlines had called it the Dalton Revelation. Thousands of homeowners shared their own stories of data misuse and invasive HOA surveillance. Lawmakers demanded hearings. And the companies who built empires on that data began to panic. The backlash came swiftly. By noon, 3 major HOA management corporations released joint statements calling her claims unfounded and irresponsible. One even accused her of endangering the stability of residential governance nationwide. They didn't use her name, but they didn't need to. She was the face of the storm. Within a week, the tone shifted from criticism to attack. Anonymous accounts flooded social media, branding her a fraud, a grifter, a failed politician. Fabricated screenshots circulated online, fake messages implying she profited from leaked contracts. Even her nonprofit, Fair Home Now, became a target. Donations were frozen by payment processors pending verification. It was strategic, coordinated, surgical. They weren't trying to disprove her. They were trying to exhaust her. But exhaustion had never stopped her before. She spent long nights combing through the damage, countering lies with evidence, writing official statements, reaching out to allies. Her voice in videos was calmer now, stripped of outrage, replaced with focus. She knew that when people weaponize noise, the only power left is composure. Still, even calm couldn't stop the tide of retaliation. 2 weeks later, she received a certified letter, a lawsuit, filed jointly by 3 HOA management firms, claiming defamation, interference with contractual relations, and dissemination of false information, resulting in measurable financial harm. It wasn't about winning. It was about burying her under paper. The amount they demanded, $20 million, was absurd, but effective. The figure alone was enough to make headlines again. News anchors debated whether Mara Dalton had gone too far. Talk shows dissected her motives. Commentators called her both revolutionary and reckless. The woman who once represented justice now stood accused of destabilizing the system she had fought to reform. And through it all, she kept working. She still chaired HOA meetings. She still answered homeowner emails. She still checked the budget line by line. The community had changed. Sunridge Meadows now operated under transparency laws she had personally drafted, but she could feel the eyes of the world pressing down on her every move. The residents were proud, but nervous. Reporters still drove by daily. Her name had become a lightning rod. And for every person who admired her, there was another who wanted her silenced. Then came the subpoena. The lawsuit had expanded, now demanding full disclosure of all communications, files, and financial records related to Fair Home Now. They were trying to dismantle her foundation from within, forcing her to spend time, money, and sanity defending herself instead of continuing her mission. She hired a small legal team, advocates who believed in her cause, but the costs mounted quickly. She sold her car, remortgaged her home. Every dollar spent on defense was a dollar taken from her movement, and still, she didn't stop. Her next video wasn't defensive. It was deliberate. Calm, she titled it, The Price of Truth. She looked directly into the camera, her tone steady. I'm not fighting corporations. I'm fighting control, the kind that hides behind fine print. The video didn't go viral this time. It went deeper. It resonated not as outrage, but as fatigue, the kind of fatigue millions of ordinary people understood. The movement reignited. Lawyers volunteered pro bono. Activists formed digital campaigns. A petition calling for the Dalton Law Federal HOA Oversight Reform reached 100,000 signatures in a week. Mara had become more than a name. She was a symbol. And symbols, she realized, can be sued into silence. Still, symbols are human, and humans break. At night, the walls of her house felt closer than ever. She found herself staring at the same ramp she'd once celebrated, now wondering if it had cost her too much. Ethan was in college now, quieter, more withdrawn. The years of cameras and threats had taken their toll on him too. When he called, his voice carried both pride and exhaustion. She missed the simplicity of their old life, before power had names, before she had one too. But simplicity, she knew, was a luxury of the untested. In the fall of that year, the lawsuits reached their first hearing. The courtroom was cold, bright, and heavy with silence. On one side sat Mara, alone but composed. On the other, a row of lawyers representing companies worth billions. They smiled politely as they filed motions. To them, she was an inconvenience, a story they wanted to end quietly. But she had evidence, documents, contracts, and video records that supported everything she'd said. The truth was on her side. What she didn't have was time. The hearings dragged on for months. Her savings dwindled. Her health faltered. But each delay, each obstacle only fueled her determination. Because she learned something in those long nights of fear and noise, the powerful fear one thing above all, persistence. By winter, one of the companies quietly offered a settlement, $250,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. It was tempting, the money could clear her debts, secure her home, rebuild her foundation. But signing meant silence. And silence was how this had all begun. She refused. Instead, she went public again. Her next video was quieter than the rest. No music, no editing, just her voice. I won't settle with silence. I've lived that life. Never again. That line echoed across the internet. Journalists replayed it. Law professors cited it. Advocates quoted it on protest signs. The corporations panicked. Their strategy of legal strangulation had backfired. The case had turned her into a martyr for transparency. 2 months later, one by one, the companies began withdrawing their suits, each citing public relations concerns. By spring, every lawsuit was dismissed. The war they'd waged on paper had ended not with verdicts, but with surrender. Because truth, once seen, could not be unlearned. The victory should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after years of noise. Mara stood on her porch that evening, the air heavy with the scent of wet grass. The ramp was still there, weathered but strong. It had seen her at her lowest and carried her to her highest. She traced its wood with her hand, remembering every step of the journey, the fines, the recall, the threats, the audits, the lawsuits. Each one had taken something from her. And yet each one had given her something too, purpose. Sunridge Meadows was no longer the same. The bylaws were rewritten, the culture rebuilt. Every meeting was open, every decision transparent. The community that once fined her for independence now thanked her for leadership. But she no longer belonged fully to Sunridge Meadows. Her story had grown larger than the neighborhood that birthed it. She had become a symbol for something greater, the slow, painful birth of accountability in a world that feared it. And though she was tired, she knew symbols don't fade, they ripple. That night, before locking up, she lit a small candle and placed it on the ramp. A quiet ritual, a reminder. It wasn't a memorial, it was a promise. For every homeowner still afraid to speak, for every family buried in fines and fear, for every person who thought they were powerless against a system. The ramp glowed under the flame's soft light, its shadow stretching across the porch like a path to somewhere new. She didn't know what tomorrow held, but she knew this. Power, once unmasked, can never again pretend to be virtue. And truth, once spoken, cannot be recalled. By spring, the world knew the name Mara Dalton not as a victim, but as a reformer. Her story had become a turning point, a reference in legal briefs, a headline in political debates, a lecture in universities about civic courage and systemic abuse. What began as one woman fighting for her right to a wheelchair ramp had grown into a nationwide reckoning. The movement she sparked, Fair Home Now, had chapters in 20 states. Its volunteers helped homeowners navigate lawsuits, demand audits, and organize recalls of corrupt boards. The symbol of the movement was simple, a wooden ramp drawn in white against a blue background. It represented accessibility, yes, but also dignity. A refusal to bow to systems built to humiliate. The media called it the reformation of the American suburb. For the first time, legislators at the state and federal levels were drafting bills addressing HOA abuse, data privacy, and homeowners' rights. They called it the Dalton Bill. It proposed limits on HOA fines, full public access to financial records, and criminal penalties for retaliation. Mara's testimony before Congress was televised. She sat before a semicircle of lawmakers, the lights of cameras burning into her skin, the quiet murmur of hundreds watching in the gallery. Her hands trembled as she read her prepared statement, not from fear, but from the weight of how far she had come. I didn't start this to be heard, she said, her voice steady. I started because I couldn't get into my own home. The room fell silent. When she finished, the applause was cautious, respectful, the kind that acknowledges truth, even when it's uncomfortable. That night, as she flew home, she looked out the plane window at the patchwork of lights below, neighborhoods like hers, each one a grid of order and illusion. She wondered how many of those lights hid the same kind of quiet tyranny she'd lived under for years. Her fight had made her powerful, but it had also made her lonely. Sunridge Meadows had changed, transparency restored, trust rebuilding, but she no longer belonged entirely to it. The neighbors who once admired her now whispered in awe or discomfort or fatigue. They loved what she'd done, but they missed what they'd lost, the peace that comes with ignorance. Every victory brings fatigue, every revolution, a shadow. She spent her days answering letters from strangers, her nights attending virtual meetings with reform committees and advocacy groups. Her life had become a schedule of calls, flights, and conferences. The ramp outside her home grew weathered. The flowers beside it wilted from neglect. Fame was never her dream, justice was. But fame, once given, cannot be returned. Still, she pressed on. She appeared on talk shows, documentaries, even a late-night segment titled The Woman Who Beat the HOA. The audiences cheered, laughed at the absurdity of her story, celebrated her courage. But behind the applause, she saw what they didn't, the sleepless nights, the fear that never quite left, the constant watchfulness that had become instinct. When she returned home from one such interview, she found a small package on her porch. Inside was a folded piece of wood, a fragment of someone else's ramp, and a handwritten note. You gave me courage to build this. Tears welled in her eyes. It wasn't fame that mattered, it was this, a stranger somewhere feeling less alone. The next week, she attended the signing ceremony for the first state version of the Dalton bill. The governor shook her hand, cameras flashing. It was official. HOA boards were now legally required to disclose all financial transactions, justify fines, and permit accessibility structures without penalty. A single clause, tucked into the text, ensured protection for any homeowner who recorded or published evidence of misconduct. It was her legacy in ink. But even victory has a cost. With every reform came resistance. Lobbyists filed appeals, corporations pushed amendments, and political opponents accused her of federal overreach. The reform she'd inspired began to fracture under the pressure of compromise. For every line that passed into law, another was softened, weakened, diluted. She attended meetings, watching legislators debate the meaning of fairness like it was theory, not life. They spoke of balance, optics, feasibility. She wanted to scream, to tell them that fairness is a theory when you've been fined for living. Instead, she sat quietly, taking notes. She had learned that the most dangerous form of corruption is to greed. It is apathy dressed as civility. Still, progress was progress. The Dalton bill passed in 5 states that year. 6 more began drafting their own versions. Fair Home now reached 10,000 members. Its forums became sanctuaries for the voiceless, single mothers, veterans, retirees, all telling the same story in different words. But as the movement grew, Mara began to feel the strain. The phone calls became endless, the emails constant. Even in her sleep, she dreamed of fines and signatures, of meetings that never ended. Her life had become the paperwork she'd once rebelled against. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd started as a woman fighting bureaucracy. Now she was buried under it. Only this time she was the one holding the pen. She began declining interviews, stopped traveling. For the first time in years, she wanted quiet. She found herself sitting on her porch more often, watching the neighborhood she'd changed. The lawns were still perfect, the sidewalks still clean, but the fear was gone. Homeowners waved to her now, not out of politeness, but gratitude. She'd given them something stronger than rules. She'd given them permission to live without fear. And yet, peace felt foreign. The ramp creaked softly under her hand, the sound of wood aging gracefully. It had carried her through rebellion, through exposure, through reform. Now it stood as a relic of everything she endured and everything she lost. One evening, her phone buzzed with a message from Ethan, a photo of him at college, smiling beside a ramp outside the student union. His caption read, "They built this after I told them your story." For the first time in months, she laughed. A soft, exhausted, genuine laugh. Change had rippled outward, far beyond her street, far beyond her name. Still, she couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Every reform movement becomes an institution, and every institution risks becoming what it once opposed. She saw it happening, small factions within Fair Home now fighting over money, recognition, and control. The purity of the cause was slowly being replaced by hierarchy. It pained her to watch it. She tried to intervene, to remind them why they'd begun, but the machine had grown too large. People wanted leaders, not principles. They wanted symbols, not work. One night, she stood before her mirror, looking at her reflection. The woman staring back was older, yes, but not weaker. The lines on her face weren't scars, they were signatures of endurance. She whispered to herself, as if reminding the world, movements don't belong to people. They belong to purpose. That week, she drafted a letter. It was addressed to the Fair Home Now board, her resignation. She would step down effective immediately. No speeches. No explanations. Just space. The next morning, she posted one final video. No set, no script, no audience. Just her on the porch, the ramp in the background. "I'm not leaving because I'm tired," she says softly. "I'm leaving because I trust you to carry this forward. The fight doesn't need a face anymore. It needs a future." The video ended with her turning the camera toward the street. Quiet, sunlit, alive. It was viewed millions of times. Shared across news outlets, quoted in articles, dissected in think pieces. But for her, it was closure. She spent the following months tending her garden, repainting her porch, restoring her ramp. She planted ivy along its edges, letting nature soften its lines. Sunridge Meadows had healed. So had she. Her name remained in the news occasionally, when new states passed Dalton bills, when journalists revisited her story, but she no longer watched. Her legacy didn't need her eyes. It was out there, living, growing, changing. And one autumn morning, as she sat outside sipping coffee, she saw something beautiful. A delivery truck stopped in front of a nearby house. Workers unloaded wood and steel, a new accessibility ramp. The homeowner, an elderly man, watched with tears in his eyes as it took shape. Mara smiled. The world had learned. The ramp wasn't rebellion anymore, it was ordinary. And that, she realized, was victory. Not headlines, not applause. Just a world where justice no longer needed her voice to be heard. The world moved on, but power never sleeps. Months passed quietly after Mara Dalton stepped down from Fair Home Now. Her days filled with small rituals, watering the garden, repairing the fence, baking bread. She no longer kept a camera near her desk, no longer checked trending hashtags. The noise of the movement had faded, leaving behind only silence and the hum of ordinary life. But silence is never permanent when power has something left to reclaim. At first, the signs were small. Articles began appearing in obscure blogs, rewriting her story. The tone was subtle, flattering on the surface, but skewed underneath. They called her the face of the early reform wave, as if she were a relic, her fight already folded neatly into history. Others suggested her actions had inspired necessary compromise, turning her defiance into compliance. It was history being rewritten while she was still alive to watch it. Then came the invitations, conferences, policy summits, roundtables. Her name was suddenly on every list again. At first, she declined them all. She'd made her peace with stepping back, but one letter stopped her. It came from a senator, one who had once supported the Dalton bill. The message was short, polite, and persuasive. He was drafting a national home governance reform act, and he wanted her insight and blessing. She hesitated, Politics had always made her wary. The moment power entered the conversation, truth tended to leave it. But she agreed to meet, quietly, without publicity. The meeting took place in a polished office overlooking a city skyline. The senator smiled, offered coffee, spoke the language of reform. He praised her courage, her legacy, her influence. Then, gradually, he explained what he wanted. The bill, he said, was modeled after her work, but modernized. It would streamline community governance and balance homeowner rights with association efficiency. The language was smooth, deliberate, but it set off alarms in her mind. When she asked for a draft, he hesitated. Finally, he handed her a folder. Inside was a 200-page proposal, dense, technical, filled with jargon. She read the first few lines and felt the air leave her lungs. It wasn't reform. It was restoration. Hidden between clauses and subsections were provisions that expanded HOA authority, allowed private management firms new oversight powers, and legalized many of the same surveillance and data practices she'd fought to expose. The entire bill had been built on her name, her story, her credibility, but its true purpose was control. The senator smiled as she closed the folder. "We'd love your endorsement," he said. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. When she left the building, the city air felt sharp, artificial, like the world she'd escaped was trying to pull her back in. The next morning, her phone buzzed again. Dozens of notifications, emails, mentions. Someone had leaked her meeting. Photos of her entering the senator's office circulated online with headlines like, "Dalton returns to the table," and "Reform hero backs federal HOA deal." She hadn't said a word publicly, but they had already written her story for her. That afternoon, she held a press conference from her porch, the same place where everything had begun years before. She looked into the cameras and spoke slowly, deliberately, as if each word carried the weight of her entire past. "I will never lend my name to control disguised as reform," she said. "If they want my blessing, they'll have to earn it with honesty." The statement went viral again, and with it came the old storm. Praise and hate, hope and fear, the machinery of public opinion roaring back to life. It felt like déjà vu, but colder. Within days, lobbyists launched a new narrative that she was out of touch, ungrateful, unable to move beyond her personal crusade. Editorials claimed the senator's bill was balanced, progressive, the natural evolution of her work. They were co-opting her legacy, rewriting rebellion into compliance. That realization hit harder than any fine, any threat, any lawsuit. Because corruption in its raw form was easy to fight. You could name it, expose it, burn it down. But corruption wearing your own face, that was harder. For weeks, she wrestled with the decision to stay silent and let them reshape her legacy, or to speak again, knowing what it would cost. The quiet life she'd built was fragile, peaceful. But peace without truth was just another lie. One night, she sat at her desk, the same desk where she'd once filed her first appeal against the HOA. The ramp outside glowed softly in the moonlight, steady, eternal. She opened her laptop. For the first time in nearly a year, she began to write. Her words weren't angry, they were resolute. She wrote about power, how it never dies, only changes form. About the illusion of reform. About how systems absorb resistance, turn it into decoration, and wear it as proof of virtue. She titled it, "The Second Corruption." The essay was published online the next morning. Within hours, it exploded across every major outlet. She dismantled the proposed bill clause by clause, exposing its hidden intentions. She used calm logic, not outrage, the precision of someone who'd spent years learning the language of bureaucratic deceit. Her final line was simple. Reform without resistance is regression with better branding. The fallout was immediate. The senator's office issued denials. Lobbyists accused her of misinterpretation. Supporters flooded comment sections with gratitude, calling her the conscience of the movement. But behind the noise, something deeper shifted. Lawmakers who'd supported the bill began backing away. Analysts dissected her essay line by line. Public pressure grew until the bill was withdrawn. She had killed it without raising her voice. And once again, she found herself at the center of a storm she never wanted. News crews returned. Reporters camped outside her home. Fair Home Now, the organization she'd left, publicly thanked her for saving the integrity of the movement. The irony wasn't lost on her. Power, she thought, is circular. Every victory becomes another battlefield. In the weeks that followed, she received hundreds of letters again, from supporters, from skeptics, from strangers who saw her not just as an activist, but as a compass. One letter stood out. It came from a young woman in another state, recently elected president of her own HOA after exposing financial abuse. The note was simple. You don't know me. But I used your videos to fight my board. We won last night. Thank you for teaching me how to stand. Mara read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer beside the photograph of her ramp. That night, she sat outside, the air cool and soft. The stars reflected faintly in the quiet pond across the street. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was fighting anyone, not even the system. She was simply existing, proof that truth, once spoken, can echo longer than any law, louder than any opposition. The ramp stood where it always had, simple, solid, weathered. It had seen the rise and fall of power. It had seen her break, rebuild, and rise again. Now it was more than a symbol, it was a reminder that real change doesn't come from power. It comes from persistence. From people who refuse to look away when everything around them tells them to. And somewhere far beyond Sunridge Meadows, in neighborhoods she would never see, people were building their own ramps, not just for access, but for independence. The echoes of her fight had turned into thousands of quiet acts of defiance. She smiled softly. The story was no longer hers. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been told to comply and chose instead to stand or roll toward freedom. And in that quiet victory, beneath a sky full of indifferent stars, Mara finally felt what she had been chasing all along. Not fame, not justice, but peace, the kind that comes when truth no longer needs a voice to live. Years passed. The name Mara Dalton became something larger than a person. It became precedent. Her fight, once confined to a single cul-de-sac, was now studied in law schools, cited in government hearings, and referenced in documentaries about civic reform. Sunridge Meadows remained quiet, almost serene, the kind of community that finally understood the cost of silence. The lawns were still perfect, the mailboxes freshly painted, but the fear was gone. The HOA, now transparent and accountable, operated with something that once seemed impossible: trust. Mara, older now, moved slower. She spent her mornings tending to her ramp's ivy, its vines curling along the wooden rails like gentle reminders that even scars can bloom. The world had moved forward, and so had corruption. In her absence, HOS had evolved. Many had adapted to the new Dalton laws, but some found new ways around them. The age of paper fines and in-person inspections had ended. The new tyranny was digital. It began quietly. Smart communities, they called them. HOAs managed by software, run by AI tools promising efficiency, fairness, and real-time compliance monitoring. The pitch was irresistible: no bias, no corruption, no human error. But behind the smooth interfaces and glowing dashboards was a darker reality. The AI systems collected everything: facial recognition footage from neighborhood cameras, parking data, even social media activity linked to home addresses. The software graded residents by compliance scores, determining who received warnings or fines. It was control disguised as convenience, the same disease, just coded in a new language. Mara first heard about it when a former colleague sent her a link. The headline read, "Automated HOA systems introduced nationwide, fair, fast, and foolproof." At first, she tried to ignore it. Her fight was done. She'd given the world her years, her peace, her privacy. But as she read deeper, the unease grew. The company behind the system, Civic Sync Technologies, claimed their model was inspired by the transparency reforms of the Dalton movement. They had used her name again. Only this time, it wasn't to silence her. It was to sell. Her legacy had become branding. The words Dalton Standard appeared throughout the company's marketing materials, implying compliance with her principles. But the fine print told a different story. Civic Sync had lobbied for exemptions from several Dalton clauses, citing technological flexibility. They turned her rebellion into a sales pitch. That night, Mara watched one of their promotional videos online. It showed smiling families, quiet neighborhoods, clean sidewalks. A narrator promised the next generation of harmonious living. The footage ended with a slogan, "The future of community, inspired by Dalton." She sat in silence, her reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. It wasn't anger she felt. It was something colder, recognition. The same machine she dismantled had learned to rebuild itself with her own tools. For days, she debated what to do. Part of her wanted to walk away, let time carry her story wherever it wished. Another part, the one that had faced down Carol Fincher and every board after, refused to watch control evolve unchecked. She began to research. What she found chilled her. Civic Sync's system was being tested in over 50 communities. Their AI not only issued fines, but tracked behavioral trends, how often residents hosted guests, what kind of decorations they used, even how long they left trash bins outside. The algorithm justified it as predictive harmony modeling. To most homeowners, it was invisible. They only saw notifications, auto-generated letters, payment links. There were no humans left to appeal to. The HOA had become faceless, a system that never slept, never argued, never apologized. It was everything she'd fought against, perfected. And yet, the cruelest irony was that her own laws had helped make it possible. The Dalton reforms had standardized digital record-keeping. They'd require transparency, audits, and data trails. Civic Sync had used those laws as the framework for total automation. Her victory had been reverse-engineered into control. One evening, as she sat by her window, watching the sun sink behind the roofs of Sunridge Meadows, she realized something bitterly true. Power never disappears. It just updates. Still, she couldn't stay silent. She began to write again, not speeches or essays, but letters. Personal ones, to lawmakers, journalists, former allies. She explained what was happening, urging them to see the danger of letting machines enforce morality. Most replied politely. A few ignored her. Some even argued that automated HOAs were better, neutral, objective, efficient. That word again, efficiency. The oldest disguised tyranny ever wore. Months passed with little change. The world was enchanted by the illusion of algorithmic fairness. Then one day, she received a message that reignited the fire in her veins. It came from a woman named Rosa Torres, president of an HOA in a newly automated community. Rosa explained that Civic Sync's system had fined a disabled resident for ramp obstruction. The software flagged it as unapproved structure and deducted the fine automatically from the resident's escrow account. Rosa tried to reverse it but found she couldn't. There was no appeal function in the system. The AI's decision was final. The resident, a retired teacher named Janice Lee, had written to Civic Sync. They responded with a generic email. "Your concern does not meet the threshold for manual review." Mara stared at the words on her screen, frozen. It was happening again. The same cruelty, the same blindness, wrapped now in code instead of policy. And once again, it was a ramp that started it. That night, she made her decision. She would fight one last time, not with outrage, not with public appearances, but with strategy. She reached out to a small network of lawyers, technologists, and former advocates from Fair Home Now. Together, they began digging into Civic Sync's software patents, contracts, and data policies. What they found was explosive. CivicSync's compliance AI didn't just monitor communities, it sold data to insurance companies, marketing agencies, and real estate firms. Homeowners' behavioral profiles were being used to predict credit risk, property value, even voting likelihood. The HOA had become a data mine, and every resident was the resource. Mara compiled the findings into a detailed report titled The Legacy Clause. The title came from a line buried in CivicSync's licensing agreement. All community behavioral data collected under this system remains the perpetual property of CivicSync Technologies, regardless of ownership or management changes. It was the ultimate betrayal of everything she had built. She released the report quietly, publishing it under her name with no fanfare, just facts, evidence, and clarity. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. By morning, every major outlet was covering it. The backlash was immediate and furious. CivicSync's stock plummeted. Government hearings were announced. Lawsuits were filed. Homeowners across the country demanded their data back. The scandal was dubbed the Digital HOA. Once again, her name was everywhere. But this time, it didn't feel like a storm, it felt like closure. Because unlike before, she wasn't alone in the fight. A new generation of advocates, young, tech-savvy, relentless, took up the cause. They spoke in her language, but with their own strength. They built networks, demanded laws, and rewrote the very code that once controlled them. Mara watched it unfold from her porch, the glow of her tablet reflecting in her eyes. She didn't need to lead anymore. The movement had evolved, just as corruption had, and finally, justice had learned how to evolve too. As the months passed, CivicSync collapsed under federal investigation. The Dalton Legacy Amendment was passed into national law, ensuring that no automated system could issue fines or collect resident data without human oversight. Her legacy, once misused, had been reclaimed. One evening, as the wind moved gently through the ivy along her ramp, Mara sat outside, listening to the hum of the quiet neighborhood. No reporters, no protests, no noise, just peace. The ramp, older now, creaked under her touch. It had been the first rebellion and the last reminder. Her fight had begun because of it. And it had ended where it began, at the intersection of power and principle, of humanity and home. She smiled faintly, whispering to the empty air, "You can build all the systems you want. But you can't automate compassion." The world didn't hear it, but it didn't need to. Because by then, it was already true. Time has a way of softening everything, even the hardest battles. The world had changed again. Years had passed since the collapse of CivicSync and the passing of the Dalton Legacy Amendment. The reforms she had once only dreamed of were now ordinary law, woven quietly into the lives of millions who would never know her name. And that, Mara Dalton thought, was how it should be. The ramp outside her home was older now, weathered, creaking slightly when the wind shifted. Ivy trailed along its edges, hurling through the rails like nature itself was reclaiming the symbol it once gave her. Every morning, she brushed away the leaves that fell across it, not out of duty but respect. It had carried her through everything: humiliation, revolution, redemption. Now it simply carries sunlight. Sunridge Meadows had grown into the kind of community she'd always wanted it to be: quiet, kind, imperfect, but decent. The lawns were still trimmed, the mailboxes neat, but there was laughter now where once there had been fear. The HOA board held its meetings in the open, live-streamed for transparency. No one was fined without review. No one feared a letter for living. Neighbors waved when they passed her porch. They didn't whisper anymore. They spoke openly, smiled, shared news. Some still called her Madam President, half in jest, half in gratitude. But she always smiled softly and said, "Not anymore. Just Mara." Her fight was history now, part of the civic mythology of modern America. Textbooks called it the Ramp Rebellion. Law students studied the Dalton laws in ethics courses. Documentaries played her interviews in black and white montages about activism and accountability, but she no longer watched. The world didn't need her voice anymore. It had found its own. Most mornings, she wrote letters, not to lawmakers, but to ordinary people who reached out, still discovering her story years later. She told them the same thing every time. The system doesn't change because people fight it once. It changes because someone, somewhere, refuses to stop asking why. She never told them that some days she missed the fight, the adrenaline, the urgency, the purpose. Peace, she had learned, could feel empty when your whole life had been resistance. But she had earned that emptiness. It was the cost of survival. Ethan visited often now. He was married, with a daughter. Her name was Claire. A curious, sharp-eyed child who asked questions about everything. She loved playing near the ramp, tracing her fingers over its wood, fascinated by the grooves and cracks. One afternoon, as Mara sat watching from her porch, Claire asked, "Grandma, why do you have this ramp if you can walk now?" Mara smiled, that small knowing smile that carried years inside it. "It's not for me anymore," she said quietly. Claire didn't understand, but she nodded solemnly, as children do when they sense something important, even if they can't yet define it. The world outside her neighborhood was still full of battles. New forms of power rose every decade, corporations, technologies, systems of control wearing different faces. But Mara no longer felt the need to chase them. Others were doing that now. People who had grown up with her story, who quoted her words, who built their own movements in the image of her defiance. Her legacy wasn't carved into law books or plaques. It was written into the quiet confidence of those who refused to be small. She often thought back to that first day, the envelope on her doorstep, the fine for her ramp, the sinking dread that she might lose her home. It felt distant now, like a dream she had once lived through someone else's memory. Back then, she had been afraid of breaking rules. Now, she understood that some rules deserved to be broken, especially the ones that mistake obedience for harmony. As the seasons changed, her body slowed. The fire that once kept her awake through endless nights of research and paperwork had dimmed into a steady warmth, not gone, just quieter. She knew she was nearing the edge of her story, but she wasn't afraid, because her story was no longer hers alone. One summer evening, the community gathered for the 50th anniversary of the HOA Reform Act. They held it in the same clubhouse where the recall had first taken place, the night she turned from defendant to president. There were speeches, laughter, stories. And at the end, they unveiled a plaque outside the building. It read, "In honor of Mara Dalton, who taught us that justice begins at home." The crowd applauded, cameras flashed. But Mara stayed seated near the back, smiling quietly, her hands folded in her lap. After the ceremony, as twilight settled, she walked home alone. The path was familiar, lined with the same streetlights, the same breeze carrying the faint scent of cut grass. When she reached her porch, she paused at the foot of the ramp. The wood was faded, but strong. Its boards held the imprint of years, of wheels, footsteps, and the weight of change. She placed her hand on it and whispered, "You did it." It wasn't the ramp she was talking to. It was everything. The fight, the fear, the faith. The reminder that the smallest act of courage can unravel the largest system of control. That night, the moonlight touched the ivy and the rails like a blessing. The house was quiet, the air still. Inside, the world continued calm, ordinary, free. And in the quiet hum of that neighborhood, the story of Mara Dalton became what all true revolutions eventually become. Not a roar, but a whisper. A whisper that said, stand when told to sit, question when told to accept, and build the ramp anyway. Because every act of defiance that begins with one person has the power to carry millions. And as long as ramps still rise in front of doors, made of wood or steel or courage, her legacy would never fade.